family, welcome to African Esquire TV. I'm your host, Tony Cherie. So last week I put out a video where I talked about the fact that Black Lives Matter has been criticized for receiving funds. And because of that, and the receiving of funds, a lot of people are essentially rebelling inside of the local chapters. The ultimate question, as I said in a previous video, was not so much that the local chapters are upset with their level of accountability, but the biggest issue to me is that who is actually funding Black Lives Matter? Who are these people who are giving them money? And are these people of the community? We know many of them are not of the community. Well, this is kind of a follow-up to that video. We're going to talk about the George Soros issue. And I know a lot of you have probably heard of him. A lot of you have probably put out different articles or shared different information about him. And I think it's something that is drastically overlooked. Not just because of that particular movement, but because of how all of our movements are being co-opted by people who literally benefit from us being inside of a state of confusion. Because understand, let's be very clear, Black liberation that does not confront capitalism is not Black liberation at all. Anytime that Black liberation has been fomented inside of such a way that does not attack the capitalist system, that issue of liberation has only been surface level. And any time that people have ever been ready and poised to confront the capitalist system, is not a coincidence that those movements have been obviously targeted, that those individuals have been targeted, that any type of pronouncement against this being in our best interest has been labeled in different ways, being unpatriotic, being communist, all types of things.
Now we must tell you in our analysis, we do not make the errors that others do. Anytime you make an analysis of an oppressed people in any aspect of their life and you leave out the enemy, you will never come to a correct analysis. On the contrary, you will blame the oppressed for all of their problems. Therefore, we tell you from the very beginning, we've never taken the line of others that the biggest problem that we have is we ourselves. No, our biggest problem is our enemy, capitalism, and it must be destroyed. We say any analysis you make of an oppressed people must include the oppressor, otherwise you will come up with an incorrect analysis blaming the oppressed for their position of oppression. Even if one were to talk about the drugs in our community, if you just talk about drugs and not talk about the enemy, you make no analysis at all. Or you may sound serious saying about, well, you know, the trouble with our kids is that all they doing is fighting for drugs and shooting each other for drugs, and I wish they would stop. If you haven't brought in the question of who brings the drugs in, why the drugs are brought in, for what purpose they're brought in, you will never understand the problem at all. Thus we make it clear to each and every one, when we speak of the conditions of the African masses, we begin from the very beginning with the enemy of the African masses, all unjust system that seeks to exploit us, capitalism, and especially the racist capitalist system in the United States of America.
So these are not coincidences. And so when we're talking about really freeing our people at home and abroad, we have to be talking about undoing the vestiges of not just colonialism, certainly colonialism, but the modern day manifestation that occurs through capitalism. So let's talk about George Soros. George Soros obviously is a very rich man, a billionaire. And so that automatically in itself should tell us that he's someone who benefits from the system of capitalism, obviously. He's obviously someone who has a lot of different ventures that are supporting him, because you don't become a billionaire passively. You become a billionaire by purposely going after the money and purposefully ensuring that your money is reaching maximum capacity. You don't become a billionaire, in my opinion, by doing things fairly or by doing things that are going to be equitably done. You only become a billionaire through exploitation. Now, it might not be obvious to many, but it's going to be obvious whenever you look at the causal relationship between those who benefit and those who are not benefiting, those who are laborers, those who lose out on opportunities because of these figures. So I'm going to first read from one article. I have a few articles I'm going to read from. This one is done by a guy named Nicholas Gulhot. It's called Reforming the World, George Soros, Global Capitalism, and the Philanthropic Management of Social Sciences. All of these articles will be in the description for all of you to read the full thing. I'm just going to read small excerpts for the issue of making this more concise. Okay, so aware that, well, first of all, the article begins with, and again, I encourage you to read it yourself, but it begins with giving a history of philanthropy for capitalism. So we know, for example, that there's been a lot of people who have been staunch capitalists who have also had foundations. For example, Andrew Carnegie, he's someone that was a big businessman back in the day. He's had a lot of philanthropic ventures. He's started a lot of libraries in Pittsburgh, where I'm from, for example. You have the Rockefeller Foundation, J.D. Rockefeller. We know about the Rockefellers, right? They had a foundation where they gave up a lot of money, right? They had the Ford Foundation. We know Henry Ford. There was a foundation for Ford. So there's a lot of a history. This is not something new. This is something that has consistently happened. And that is what this article breaks down. So it says, aware that social reform was unavoidable, these people who I just mentioned, they chose to invest in the definition and the scientific treatment of the social questions of their time. They said urbanization, education, housing, public hygiene, and the Negro problem are things that they wanted to deal with. Far from being resistant to social change, the philanthropists promoted reformist solutions that did not threaten the capitalist nature of the social order, but constituted a private alternative to socialism. Let that resonate, a private alternative to socialism. So there's an idea that you have socialism when you're saying the means of production is going to be controlled by the masses, all these factories and everything, the masses are going to control that. Well, there's that idea, but there's people who say we could find a way to not achieve that end, but we can find a way to make people feel like they're inside of a system that is one that is fair and equitable without necessarily doing that. So we can create a private idea of socialism that's going to deal with things that do not threaten capitalism. So I want to repeat this: urbanization, education, housing, okay, public hygiene, and they said the Negro problem. These were viewed as not threatening capitalism. Now, we would think, oh, that must threaten capitalism. Housing. Well, no, you can do housing in a very equitable way that still ensures that the people who are making billions of dollars off of the different real estate, that those people are still protected. Education. You can still give people lots of education, completely equal education. Honestly, the United States could do better without losing a bit. But these are issues that are not going to change the social dynamics that exist. And interestingly enough, they said public hygiene also said the Negro problem, okay? Meaning the problem of us Africans in the United States who have been saying that we want equality. Well, we should know by now that they dealt with that by giving us these piecemeal legislations that are going to pacify the bourgeoisie because they see themselves as benefiting. They see themselves as being given a foot in the door, but not the masses of African people. Most of us are still in the same position whenever you look at our relationship to the system. It's not, we have to stop getting carried away with the open brutality of the system and understand that the system relies on that relationship to continue. The relationship between exploiter and exploited. If that relationship continues, then the system continues and the system is maintained. And since slavery, that system has not changed. We are still exploited and they are still exploiter through many, many different systems in the United States, whether it's the education system, the criminal justice system, so many systems that come together and form this country, we're still the exploited. Now, keep all of that in mind with the modern context, because obviously things don't change too much. And listen to this quote by George Soros. He says, the development of our international institutions has not kept pace with the development of our international financial markets, and our political arrangements have lagged behind the globalization of the economy. Based on his premises, I have formulated a set of practical proposals that would make capitalism more stable and equitable. Okay, that was George Soros in 2002. So we know from the outpost, his goal is to make capitalism more stable and more equitable. That's his goal. He said it. Okay. Article goes on to say that creating political forms corresponding to the reality of globalized capital, however, faces two hurdles, according to Soros. One is market fundamentalist and anti-globalization activist, okay? Against the former, market fundamentalist Soros asserted the need to regulate the global economy in order to ensure its sustainability and to make its contradictions and conflicts amenable to administrative management. So let's just explain that a little bit more. So market fundamentalists, these are the people who say completely free markets, no regulation. We know them probably more so as being conservatives inside of the United States context, but in the global context, these are people who say free markets, no check power. Let us do what we want to do. You come, we come back at you. That is what they are. So as far as these people, he's against them. Okay. So that's where I think we get confused. He is against those people who say, we're going to take all the power, we're going to take all the money, don't try to tell us how to run our business. He's against that. Okay. But he's also against the anti-globalization activists. These people challenge for these people, the challenge is to make sure that the new areas of global regulations, such as human rights, gender issues, or environmental protection, do not call into question economic globalization, but on the contrary, secure it. And when we say globalization, it's essentially global capitalism, right? It's the idea that these companies that come out of the West are not just going to stay where they are and exploit where they are, but they're going to go global and they're going to exploit all people who are there for the taking. Now, in this respect, a key strategy consists in developing expertise in these areas and fostering scientific professionals. The realist approaches to these, in other words, are an expertise modeled after that found in international institutions incompatible with their agendas. Okay. And also, I do want to highlight, as it says in the article, their concerns is to make things like human rights, gender issues, environmental protection. Those are going to be the narrative. We're not going to call into question the economic exploitation. Okay, understand economic globalization. Don't call that into question. Call into question these issues that we're going to label as human rights, but they do not call into question our power. Okay, so this strategy is deeply ingrained in a world philanthropic project. The first philanthropists of the industrial era also struggled to confine the social sciences within the limits of a reformist project that preserves the economic interests of their class. Later in their international dealings, foundations sought to foster the emergence of modernizing and pragmatic elites who could confine social reform within the parameters of existing and economic global order. More recently, in the 1960s, the gurus of the Ford Foundation, a committee of lawyers from the American bar, played a crucial role in bringing the environmental movement to big business and industry under the pretext of strengthening its professionalism. Okay. So one reason why Soros project has become hegemonic is precisely that it is open to conflicting interpretations and that it may be acceptable to actors who otherwise tend to oppose each other. The World Bank and the IMF officials, as well as their critics, the State Department officials, as well as human rights activists, and neoliberals, as well as critics of globalization. And just as the 19th and 20th century philanthropists were trying to reduce the opposition between capital and labor by investing in progressive scientific ideologies promising to overcome it, today's philanthropists struggle to reduce the opposition between financial institutions and NGOs by organizing their convergence and by creating a common curriculum for these emerging professionals of globalization. So that was a lot. And just brief overview before we go into the next article. So essentially, that is how George Soros operates. He is someone who's not saying that, hey, don't have any regulations, don't have any types of rights given to people, but certainly do not have rights that are going to challenge us in our dominance. And let's keep the dialogue in places where it's not going to question us. Now, because of that, though, because he is okay, because he's for certain human rights, he's for human rights that do not question his economic position, that gives him the ability to mirage himself as being, or depict himself rather, as being someone who is for progress. And that puts us in a position where a lot of people are willing to collaborate because we think, hey, you're for some human rights, you're for some from racial equality. Well, we're for racial equality, so therefore we have similar interests. Let's come together. Well, no, that's only racial equality to pacify us from moving forward into a full force takeover of capitalism that's going to threaten our people and leave us still enslaved to the system. And so let's go to the next article. It says, Soros funds regime change, and this is in Zimbabwe. The significance of education as a reform of regime change and a channel for promoting Western interests in Africa and the Middle East has once again brought to the fore by notorious regime change agent George Soros, who last week pledged over $1 million US to fund a university network to aid civil society and fight authoritarian governments. In 2003, Soros Open Society Initiative, and maybe you may have heard of this institute. I've heard of it, particularly when I was leaving law school and I was looking for different opportunities. And I was presented with this open society and it sounded amazing. It sounded like, oh, we want to sponsor race equity and all these things that I'm like, okay, fine. And so that's something that a lot of us who might be looking for a way to help our communities, we might become familiar with the Open Society Initiative. Well, the one in South Africa was established in 2003. And since then, it has been churning out graduates whose skills are mainly relevant to civil society and with it, regime change agent projects. Now, to posit civil society, I know that sounds good, but let's think about the reality of our people. The reality of our people, as I've said in another video, is that democracy is not necessarily the engine to bring about our liberation. And democracy has consistently been used in order to churn out people who are radical and to sponsor people who are going to go forward with the Western agenda. So when you consider that and consider the fact that there's not one country in Africa that at this point that is without that is without being inside of a colonized state. When you consider these factors, you understand that civil society means continuing on inside of a colonized state without any check on power by Western industrialists and imperialists who are going to enforce their agendas through the local politics of African politicians. So this is something that might sound good, but when it's played out, we understand that it's just neocolonialism as usual, ensuring that their guys in and that the people's champions are shut out and that the people are actually shut out in the end. So it says Soros funds the Peace Studies program in local universities who design content is done in the United States Institute for Peace. Okay, that's an organization that purports to preach peace while acting to the contrary. Apart from the peace studies, the OSISA has also deployed pseudo-academics from the civil society sector who specialize in publishing skewed articles for European and Asian journalists based on propaganda material. The pseudo-academics donning the garb of university teachers engage in the crime of laundering propaganda into scholarships. It says Soros is holding hand when it comes to the Open Society for South Africa's agenda. Soros has decided to adopt a no-holds-barred approach to regime change politic in Zimbabwe. The director of this effort is a Zimbabwean called Sifosami Mulunga. I hope I pronounced that correct. Mulunga is the executive director of the Open Society Initiative for Southern Africa, based in Johannesburg, South Africa. So Soros has become notorious for funding regime change agendas in Africa and other parts of the world. He works with both the National Endowment for Democracy of the United States, this is the NED, and the British equivalent, the Westminster Foundation for Democracy, the WFD, for the purpose of regime change and the promotion of Western values in Africa. George Soros created an organization called Soros Open Society Institute, which runs out of at least 4 regional operations. Namely, they have an Open Society Initiative for Southern Africa, the Open Society Initiative for East Africa, the Open Society Initiative for West Africa, and the Open Society Foundation in South Africa. Okay? Just another, by the way, anytime I see any type of corporation which has a direct agenda targeted at Africa, that's always something of a concern. The Open Society Initiative's objective is to build, quote, build and strengthen the values, practices, and institutions of an open society throughout Southern Africa to promote open markets, okay, open markets and free enterprises, where governments in pursuing programs of economic indigenization. In pursuit of the objectives, the OSI said that it spends more than $400 million annually in the last few years it has. Okay, and it says some of George Soros' initiatives are ridiculous. For example, in Uganda, he was focused on spreading human rights awareness among prostitutes. He's had many business interests in Africa, hence his involvement throughout the continent. And in Southern Africa, the OSISA operates in 10 countries. Zimbabwe is of special interest to George Soros because of its rich minerals and other resources. His regime change efforts are concentrated on Zimbabwe more than any other country in the region, okay? You can start to imagine why. Chikin says that Soros got into the business of manipulating African governments in the 1990s when he was already heavily invested in the British Imperial African planters and mining, okay? In Zimbabwe, he owns a plantation. It's the Plantation and General Company, chaired by the Rhodesia-born Rupert Pennant-Ray, a former deputy governor of the Bank of England and a director, along with Lord Renwick, in the Rupert family Richmond Group, with assets in Zimbabwe and Russia. Throughout these holdings, Soros tried to take over the vast interest of a tiny Roland in Lonho, Africa, the London and Rhodesia Mining and Land Corporation, okay? According to Chaikin, George Soros' current push to overthrow the Zimbabwe government was organized by British strategists working in conjunction with the Zimbabwean white plantation owners between 2000 and 2005. And I'm sure you guys probably know this, but Mugabe, when he was living, he was Britain's number one enemy in the United States because of what he did. He said, all right, well, y'all took this land from us during colonization. We're taking it back and we have a right to it. And that automatically made him public enemy number one of every single imperialist and colonialist, because ultimately they do not want to see a situation where every single African country seizes what was taken from them during the colonization of their countries. So it's clear why it's clearly has to be concerning that we see so many connections with Soros, with not just the United States, but with Britain, two of Mugabe's biggest adverse people who were just directly his enemies, basically. So further confirmation of Soros OSI being part of NED is the Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which was once owned by the CIA, okay, was handed over to the Open Society Initiative in 1993. Let me say that again. The Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, it was once owned by the CIA, and it was handed over to the Open Society Initiative in 1993. Okay, it is strongly suspected that Soros reports and takes orders from David Lowe, the vice president of the international head of the NED and NED's point man in its regime change activities against Zimbabwe. He has a long history of involvement in politics in South Africa. He was reported to have worked very closely with Jack Abramoff, of his political partner, as part of the American-based spy network for South African apartheid government. Okay. Apart from his funding of non-governmental organizations and groups to promote regime change agenda, Soros has been funding the MDC. So once again, I encourage you to read the articles fully. I'm going to go through one more article. This is from Brother Obi Egbuna. If you remember, he was on my channel about a month ago. He wrote an article. It says, George Soros' wallet from Ferguson to Harar. As we struggle to maintain the course by maintaining steadfast to the principles that bring us together, part of the parcel of this process is to attack and exploit the weaknesses in the vision of our enemies, each and every time the opportunity presents itself. On January 14, 2015, the Washington Times writer Kelly Riddell published an article entitled George Soros Funds Ferguson Protest, Hopes to Spur Civil Action, okay? If you remember, back in that time when Ferguson was happening, it came out that George Soros was this guy who was supposedly just helping the people in Ferguson, right? It says the time may soon be coming. We're finding a US-based grassroots organization that is not funded by Mr. Soros may be more challenging than finding churches in the 70s, 80s, and 90s whose palms were not greased by Reverend Moon and the Unification Church. The article reveals that in 2014, Soros spent $33 million on political activities in Ferguson. The recipients included Samuel DeWitt, Proctor Conference, the Drug Policy Alliance, the Make the Road New York, Equal Justice USA from Sojourners, the Advancement Project, the Center for Community Change, and networks from the Gamaliel Foundation. The article chimes in on the connection between the drug policy analysis and the hashtag Black Lives Matter. The DPA receives $4 million annually from Mr. Soros. And it says this shows Mr. Soros is out to kill two birds with one big expensive stone. He is aiming to dilute the militancy of our movement against police brutality and terrorism. And at the same time, through the Open Society Initiative for Southern Africa, playing a role in financing the overthrow of President Mugabe and the ZANU-PF. The crisis in Zimbabwe, and obviously this article is dated because we know President Mugabe has since passed on, but the crisis in Zimbabwe coalition, who's been bankrolled by OECSA, is home to 350 civil society organizations, the multitude of objectives and functions. When we follow the purse strings, it's clear that Mr. Soros cannot have his shock troopers in the US clashing with their co-workers in Zimbabwe. So what does this mean for us? Particularly, I'm going to speak about us who are in the United States. What does this mean for us, or us in any place really, who is complicit with these types of organizations? But what does that mean for us whenever we're dealing with these types of people? So first, let's understand your agenda. George Soros is not going to fund any organization that is seen as a threat to capitalism. That has to be said on the outset. Any organization that is seen as a threat to capitalism, the capitalist system that enslaved you, put you in the jail, put you in the chains, the one that still is living and breathing from your labor, that capitalist system, and the one that threatens you consistently with violence, that capitalist system, he's not going to fund any organization that he views as a threat to that system. He'll fund organizations that might be helpful to African people. There are a lot of organizations that may help African people. There are a lot of charitable organizations, but those organizations that get us to confront the real issue, that's out of the question. That's something that's important for us to know, because you have someone who's going through our liberation struggle and targeting some of us and saying, okay, these people, I'm going to move you to the front. These people, I want you to be the spokesperson for this movement. And let's shut out these people who are speaking directly to the masses of African people. Let's shut you out. Let's shut out those who are very much anti-globalization, those who are Pan-Africanists, who are saying you don't get to not only exploit us in the US, you don't get to exploit our people overseas. You don't get to do things that are going to compromise their liberation wherever they are. Those people are going to be quieted, and the people who are seen as non-threatening are going to be elevated. Now, this is not to say that the people who are viewed as non-threatening are necessarily bad people. A lot of them are people who we probably would work with, a lot of people who would help us, who align with us in a lot of ways. But the issue is, again, what are we doing whenever we're collaborating with these capitalists who have no interest in our liberation? As the article said, we're compromising ourselves. We're compromising our liberation struggle. And we have to understand that the way that the system operates, it's a lot more slick than it was previously. The system will particularly single you out in order to make something the narrative or something the headline that's not going to be a threat to the system, in order to alienate those who are directly going against the system and directly trying to fight the system of global capitalism. So final comment that we should also understand again is that when we look at what's happening as far as Zimbabwe, a country that right now obviously is being led by someone who, in my opinion, is a complete neo-colonial puppet, Emerson Mnangagwa, who is trying his best to get back in the good graces of the United States. But we also understand that Zimbabwe as a place is still under sanction. Number one, the sanctions have not been lifted because of what was done by Mugabe when he said, we're taking this land back. And because of that, they are inside of a very fragile place, because they are inside of a place where they are still considered an enemy to the West. And so the fact that this person has purposefully push for regime change inside of a country that is so sacred to our liberation, so sacred to African liberation in general, that's something that should be seen as a complete assault on our people. So I end this by saying we have to stop this idea that our liberation struggle only goes as far as the United States. Our liberation struggle goes every single place where we are. And whenever we betray the liberation of our brothers and sisters in Africa, you might as well betray your own mother or your father, because you're betraying your own people globally, and you're betraying them domestically. So that's what I have on this story. I'm very interested to see your comments. What are your thoughts? Have you heard about these issues? I was not aware of just how deep it went before reading these articles. But as I said, everything will be posted in the description for you to go through and come to your own analysis. So that's all I have, and I will see you in the next video.